7. It is of great importance that the sinner should be made to feel his guilt, and not left to the impression that is unfortunate. I think this is a very prevailing fault, particularly with printed books on the subject. They are calculated to make the sinner think more of his sorrows than of his sins, and feel that his state is rather unfortunate than criminal. Perhaps most of you have seen a very lovely little book recently published entitled Todd's Lectures to Children. It is very fine, exquisitely fine, and happy in some of its illustrations of truth, but it has one very serious fault. Many of its illustrations, I may say most of them, are not calculated to make a correct impression respecting the guilt of sinners, or to make them feel how much they have been to blame. This is very unfortunate. If the writer had guarded his illustrations on this point, so as to make them impress sinners with a sense of their guilt, I do not see how a child could read through that book and not be converted. Multitudes of the books written for children, and for adults too, within the last 20 years, have run into this mistake to an alarming degree. Mrs. Sherwood's writings have this fault standing out upon almost every page. They are not calculated to make the sinner blame or condemn himself. Until you can do this, the gospel will never take effect. 8. A prime object with the preacher must be to make present obligation felt. I have talked, I suppose, with many thousands of anxious sinners, and I have found that they had never before felt the pressure of present obligation. The impression is not commonly made by ministers in their preaching that sinners are expected to repent now. And if ministers suppose they make this impression, they deceive themselves. Most commonly, any other impression is made upon the minds of sinners by the preacher than that they are expected now to submit. But what sort of gospel is this? Does God authorize such an impression? Is this according to the preaching of Jesus Christ? Does the Holy Spirit, when striving with the sinner, make the impression upon his mind that he is not expected to obey now? Was any such impression produced by the preaching of the apostles? How does it happen that so many ministers now preach so as in fact to make an impression upon their hearers that they are not expected to repent now? Until the sinner's conscience is reached on this subject, you preach to him in vain. And until ministers learn how to preach so as to make the right impression, the world never can be converted. Oh, to what an alarming extent does the impression now prevail among the impenitent that they are not expected to repent now, but must wait God's time. 9. Sinners ought to be made to feel that they have something to do, and that is to repent. That it is something which no other being can do for them, neither God nor man, and something which they can do and do now. Religion is something to do, not something to wait for. And they must do it now, or they are in danger of eternal death. 10. Ministers should never rest satisfied until they have annihilated every excuse of sinners. The plea of, quote, inability is the worst of all excuses. It slanders God, so, in charging him with infinite tyranny, in commanding men to do that which they have no power to do. Make the sinner see and feel that this is the very nature of his excuse. Make the sinner see that all pleas in excuse for not submitting to God are an act of rebellion against him. Tear away the last lie which he grasps in his hand, and make him feel that he is absolutely condemned before God. 11. Sinners should be made to feel that if they now grieve away the Spirit of God, it is very probable that they will be lost forever. There is infinite danger of this. They should be made to understand why they are dependent on the Spirit, and that it is not because they cannot do what God commands, but because they are unwilling. But that they are so unwilling that it is just as certain that they will not repent without the Holy Ghost as if they were now in hell, or as if they were actually unable. They are so opposed and so unwilling that they never will repent in the world unless God sends His Holy Spirit upon them. Show them, too, that a sinner under the gospel who hears the truth preached, if converted at all, is generally converted young. And if not converted while young, he is commonly given up of God. Where the truth is preached, sinners are either gospel-hardened or converted. I know some old sinners are converted, but they are rather exceptions, and by no means common. Commentary note here. All the more reason to focus your gospel preaching on college campuses. College campuses are the perfect place to be preaching the gospel. Take, for example, all the greatest open-air preachers of our day right now. Kerrigan Skelly, Jesse Morrell, and all these types of guys. They focus on campus preaching. Yes, they do street preaching and this and that, and go to events, but going to college campuses, and especially public college campuses, should be the focus. And I will tell you why I think that this is. Firstly, young people, especially college people, are in a state of their life where they're questioning the things that they've been raised under. They're trying to figure out what they believe. They're trying to figure out the world, and they're developing a worldview. You preach the gospel to them, they're probably going to be open to what you have to say then more than at any other time in their life. Secondly, universities are ideological centers. Every idea and thought and philosophy is bred at a university setting. And thirdly, public universities and public colleges have laws and rules where public speech and free speech is generally acceptable, but you have to go through student activities, campus activities, and secure permission to do that within the confines of the law. But especially public universities and public colleges are welcoming of open-air preachers, provided that you do everything according to the rules of that college and that campus student activity center. So I would just emphasize that preaching the gospel doesn't need to be exclusively at universities, but in keeping with what Finney said, some old sinners are converted, but they are rather exceptions and by no means common. And he talks about, you know, in his experience with revivals, a sinner that is under the gospel who hears the truth preached, if converted at all, is generally converted young. Okay? In his experience with revivals, it is young people who are converted. I also remember reading in the Faithful Narrative by Jonathan Edwards that most of the people that were converted under the Great Awakening of 1735 with Jonathan Edwards, they were also young college-age people. And so it was that's the age, 18, early 20s, trying to figure out the meaning of life, trying to, they're open to ideas, they're open to thoughts, they're open to they're questioning everything, questioning, the worldview, and they're willing. The gospel is more fertile ground than it ever. Okay, let me continue. I wish now, secondly, to make a few remarks on the manner of preaching. 1. It should be conversational. Preaching, to be understood, should be colloquial in its style. A minister must preach just as he would talk, if he wishes to be fully understood. Nothing is more calculated to make a sinner feel that religion is some mysterious thing that he cannot understand than this mouthing, formal, lofty style of speaking so generally employed in the pulpit. The minister ought to do as the lawyer does when he wants to make a jury understand him perfectly. He uses a style perfectly colloquial. This lofty, swelling style will do no good. The gospel will never produce any great effects until ministers talk to their hearers in the pulpit as they talk in private conversation. 2. It must be in the language of common life. Not only should it be colloquial in its style, but the words should be such as are in common use. Otherwise they will not be understood. In the New Testament you will observe that Jesus Christ invariably uses words of the most common kind. You scarcely find a word of his instructions that any child cannot understand. The language of the Gospels is the plainest, simplest, and most easily understood of any language in the world. For a minister to neglect this principle is wicked. Some ministers use language that is purely technical in preaching. They think to avoid the mischief by explaining the meaning fully at the outset, but this will not answer. It will not affect the object in making the people understand what he means. If he uses a word that is not in common use and that people do not understand, his explanation may be very full, but the difficulty is that people will forget his explanations and then use words that are all Greek to them. Or if he uses a word in common use but employs it in an uncommon sense, giving his special explanations, it is no better, for the people will soon forget his special explanations, and then the impression actually conveyed to their minds will be according to their common understanding of the word. And thus he will never convey the right idea to his congregation. It is amazing how many men of thinking minds there are in congregations who do not understand the most common technical expressions employed by ministers, such as regeneration, sanctification, etc. Use words that can be perfectly understood. Do not, for fear of appearing unlearned, use language half Latin and half Greek, which the people do not understand. The apostle says the man is a barbarian who uses language that the people do not understand. And if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself for the battle? This is from 1 Corinthians 13. In the apostles' days there were some preachers who were marvelously proud of displaying their command of language and showing off the variety of tongues they could speak, which the common people could not understand. The apostle rebukes this spirit sharply and says, I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that by my voice I might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. I have sometimes heard ministers preach, even when there was a revival, when I have wondered what that part of the congregation would do who had no dictionary. So many phrases were brought in, manifestly to adorn the discourse, rather than to instruct the people, that I have felt as if I wanted to tell the man, sit down and not confound the people's minds with your barbarian preaching they cannot understand. 3. Preaching should be parabolical. That is, illustrations should be constantly used, drawn from incidents, real or supposed. Jesus Christ constantly illustrated his instructions in this way. He would either advance a principle and then illustrate it by a parable, that is, a short story of some event, real or imaginary, or else he would bring out the principle in the parable. There are millions of facts that can be used to advantage, and yet very few ministers dare to use them, for fear somebody will reproach them. "Oh," says somebody, "he tells stories." "Tells stories? Why, that is the way Jesus Christ preached, and it is the only way to preach. Facts, real or supposed, should be used to show the truth. Truths not illustrated are generally just as well calculated to convert sinners as a mathematical demonstration. Is it always to be so? Shall it always be matter of reproach that ministers follow the example of Jesus Christ in illustrating truths by facts? Let them do it, and let fools reproach them as storytelling ministers. They have Jesus Christ and common sense on their side. 4. The illustrations should be drawn from common life and the common business of society. I once heard a minister illustrate his ideas by the manner in which merchants transact business in their stores. Another minister who was present made some remarks to him afterwards. He objected to this illustration particularly because, he said, it was too familiar and was letting down the dignity of the pulpit. He said that all illustration in preaching should be drawn from ancient history or from some elevated source that would keep up the dignity of the pulpit. Dignity indeed, just the language of the devil. He rejoices in it. Why, the object of an illustration is to make people see the truth, not to bolster up pulpit dignity. A minister whose heart is in the work does not use an illustration to make people stare, but to make them see the truth. If he brought forward his illustrations from ancient history, it could not make the people see. It would not illustrate anything. The novelty of the thing might awaken their attention, but then they would lose the truth itself. For if the illustration itself be a novelty, the attention will be directed to this fact as a matter of history, and the truth itself, which it was designed to illustrate, will be lost sight of. The illustration should, if possible, be a matter of common occurrence, and the more common the occurrence, the more sure it will be not to fix attention upon itself, but it serves as a medium through which the truth is conveyed. I have been pained at the very heart at hearing illustrations drawn from ancient history of which not 1 in 100 of the congregation had ever heard. The very manner in which they were adverted to was strongly tinctured, to say the least, with the appearance of vanity, in an attempt to surprise the people with an exhibition of learning. The Savior always illustrated his instructions by things that were taking place among the people to whom he preached, and with which their minds were familiar. He descended often very far below what is now supposed to be essential to support the dignity of the pulpit. He talked about the hens and chickens, and children in marketplaces, and sheep and lambs, shepherds and farmers, and husbandmen and merchants. And when he talked about kings, as in the marriage of the king's son, and the noblemen that went into a far country to receive a kingdom, he had reference to historical facts that were well known among the people at the time. The illustration should always be drawn from things so common that the illustration itself will not attract attention away from the subject, but that people may see through it the truth illustrated. 5. Preaching should be repetitious. If a minister wishes to preach with effect, he must not be afraid of repeating whatever he sees is not perfectly understood by his hearers. Here is the evil of using notes. The preacher preaches right along just as he has it written down, and cannot observe whether he is understood or not. If he interrupts his reading and attempts to catch the countenances of his audience, and to explain where he sees they do not understand, he gets lost and confused and gives it up. If a minister has his eyes on the people he is preaching to, he can commonly tell by their looks whether they understand him. And if he sees they do not understand any particular point, let him stop and illustrate it. If they do not understand one illustration, let him give another, and make it all clear to their minds before he goes on. But those who write their sermons go right on, in a regular consecutive train, just as in an essay or a book, and do not repeat their thoughts till the audience fully comprehend them. I was conversing with one of the first advocates in this country. He said the difficulty which preachers find in making themselves understood is that they do not repeat enough. Says he, in addressing a jury, I always expect that whatever I wish to impress upon their minds, I shall have to repeat at least twice, and often I repeat it 3 or 4 times, and even as many times as there are jurymen before me. Otherwise, I do not carry their minds along with me, so that they can feel the force of what comes afterwards. If a jury under oath, called to decide on the common affairs of this world, cannot apprehend an argument unless there is so much repetition, how is it to be expected that men will understand the preaching of the gospel without it? In like manner, the minister ought to turn an important thought over and over before his audience, till even the children understand it perfectly. Do not say that with so much repetition will create disgust in cultivated minds. It will not disgust. This is not what disgusts thinking men. They are not weary of the efforts a minister makes to be understood. The fact is, the more simple a preacher's illustrations are, and the more plain he makes everything, the more men of mind are interested. I know that men of the first minds often get ideas that they never had before from illustrations which were designed to bring the gospel down to the comprehension of the child. Such men are commonly so occupied with the affairs of this world that they do not think much on the subject of religion, and they therefore need the plainest preaching, and they will like it. 6. A minister should always feel deeply his subject, and then he will suit the action to the word, and the word to the action, so as to make the full impression which the truth is calculated to make. He should be in solemn earnest in what he says. I heard lately a most judicious criticism on this subject. How important it is that a minister should feel what he says. Then his actions will, of course, correspond to his words. If he undertakes to make gestures, his arms may go like a windmill, and yet make no impression. It requires the utmost stretch of art on the stage for the actors to make their hearers feel. The design of elocution is to teach this skill. But if a man feels his subject fully, he will naturally do it. He will naturally do the very thing that elocution laboriously teaches. See any common man in the streets who is earnest in talking. See with what force he gestures. See a woman or a child in earnest. How natural! To gesture with their hands is as natural as it is to move their tongue and lips. It is the perfection of eloquence. Let a minister, then, only feel what he says, and not be tied to his notes, to read an essay, or to speak a piece, like a schoolboy. First on one foot and then on the other. Put out first one hand and then the other. Let him speak as he feels and act as he feels, and he will be eloquent. No wonder that a great deal of preaching produces so little effect. Gestures are of more importance than is generally supposed. Mere words will never express the full meaning of the gospel. The manner of saying it is almost everything. Suppose one of you, that is a mother, goes home tonight, and as soon as you get into the door, the nurse comes rushing up to you with her whole soul in her countenance, and tells you that your child is burnt to death. You would believe it, and you would feel it too at once. But suppose she comes and tells you it in a cold and careless manner. Would that arouse you? No. It is the earnestness of her manner and the distress of her looks that tells the story. You know something is the matter before she speaks a word. I once heard a remark made respecting a young minister's preaching which was instructive. He was uneducated, in the common sense of the term, but well calculated to win souls. It was said of him, the manner in which he comes in and sits in the pulpit and rises to speak is a sermon of itself. It shows that he has something to say that is important and solemn. That man's manner of saying some things I have known to move the feelings of a whole congregation, when the same things said in a prosing way would have produced no effect at all. A fact which was stated by one of the most distinguished professors of elocution in the United States ought to impress ministers on this subject. That man was an infidel. He said, "I have been 14 years employed in teaching elocution to ministers, and I know they do not believe the Christian religion." The Bible may be true. I do not pretend to know as to that, but I know these ministers do not believe it. I can demonstrate that they do not. The perfection of my art is to teach them to speak naturally on this subject. I go to their studies and converse with them, and they speak eloquently. I say to them, "Gentlemen, if you will preach just as you yourselves naturally speak on any other subject in which you are interested, you do not need to be taught. That is just what I am trying to teach you. I hear you talk on other subjects with admirable force and eloquence. I see you go into the pulpit, and you speak and act as if you did not believe what you are saying. I have told them again and again to talk in the pulpit as they naturally talk to me, and I cannot make them do it. And so I know they do not believe the Christian religion." I have mentioned this to show how universal it is that men will gesture right if they feel right. The only thing in the way of ministers being natural speakers is that they do not deeply feel. How can they be natural in elocution when they do not feel? 7. A minister should aim to convert his congregation. But you will ask, does not all preaching aim at this? No. A minister always has some aim in preaching, but most sermons were never aimed at converting sinners. And if sinners were converted under them, the preacher himself would be amazed. I once heard a fact on this point. There were 2 young ministers who had entered the ministry at the same time. One of them had great success in converting sinners, the other none. The latter inquired of the other one day what was the reason of this difference. "Why," replied the other, "the reason is that I aim at a different end from you in preaching. My object is to convert sinners, but you aim at no such thing. And then you go and lay it to the sovereignty of God that you do not produce the same effect, when you never aim at it. Here, take one of my sermons, and preach it to your people, and see what the effect will be." The man did so, and preached the sermon, and it did produce effect. He was frightened when sinners began to weep, and when one came to him after meeting to ask what he should do, the minister apologized to him and said, "I did not aim to wound you. I am sorry if I have hurt your feelings." Oh, horrible. 8. A minister must anticipate the objections of sinners and answer them. What does the lawyer do when pleading before a jury? Oh, how differently is the cause of Jesus Christ pleaded from human causes. It was remarkable by a lawyer that the cause of Jesus Christ had the fewest able advocates of any cause in the world, and I partly believe it. Does a lawyer go along in his argument in a regular train and not explain anything obscure or anticipate the arguments of his antagonist? If he did so, he would lose his case to a certainty. But no, a lawyer who is pleading for money anticipates every objection which may be made by his antagonist and carefully removes or explains them so as to leave the ground all clear as he goes along, that the jury may be settled on every point. But ministers often leave one difficulty and another untouched. Sinners who hear them feel the difficulty, and it is never got over in their minds, and they never know how to remove it, and perhaps the minister never takes the trouble to know that such difficulties exist, and yet he wonders why his congregation is not converted and why there is no revival. How can he wonder at it when he has never hunted up the difficulties and objections that sinners feel and removed them? 9. If a minister means to preach the gospel with effect, he must be sure not to be monotonous. If he preaches in a monotonous way, he will preach the people to sleep. Any monotonous sound, great or small, if continued, disposes people to sleep. The falls of Niagara, the roaring of the ocean, or any sound ever so great or small, has this effect naturally on the nervous system. You never hear this monotonous manner from people in conversation, and a minister cannot be monotonous in preaching if he feels what he says. 10. A minister should address the feelings enough to secure attention and deal with the conscience and probe to the quick. Appeals to the feelings alone will never convert sinners. If the preacher deals too much in these, he may get up in excitement and have wave after wave of feeling flow over the congregation, and people may be carried away as with a flood and rest in false hopes. The only way to secure sound conversions is to deal faithfully with the conscience. If attention flags at any time, appeal to the feelings again and rouse it up, but do your work with conscience. 11. If he can, it is desirable that a minister should learn the effect of one sermon before he preaches another. Let him learn if it is understood, if it has produced any impression, if any difficulties are felt in regard to the subject which need clearing up, if any objections are raised, and the like. When he knows it all, then he knows what to preach next. What would be thought of the physician who should give medicine to his patient and then give it again and again without trying to learn the effect of the first, or whether it had produced any effect or not? A minister never will be able to deal with sinners as he ought, till he can find out whether his instruction has been received and understood, and whether the difficulties in sinners' minds are cleared away, and their path open to the Savior, so that they need not stumble and stumble till their souls are lost. I had designed to notice several other points, but time does not admit. I wish to close with a few remarks. Few remarks. 1. We see why so few of the leading minds in many communities are converted. Until the late revivals, professional men were rarely reached by preaching, and they were almost all infidels at heart. People almost understood the Bible to warrant the idea that they could not be converted. The reason is obvious. The gospel had not been commended to the consciences of such men. Ministers had not grappled with mind and reasoned so as to make that class of mind see the truth of the gospel and feel its power, and consequently such persons had come to regard religion as something unworthy their notice. But of late years the case has altered, and in some places there have been more of this class of persons converted in proportion to their numbers than of any others. That is because they were made to understand the claims of the gospel. The preacher grappled with their minds and showed them the reasonableness of religion. And when this is done, it is found that that class of minds are more easily converted than any other. They have so much better capacity to receive an argument, and are so much more in the habit of yielding to the force of reason, that as soon as the gospel gets a fair hold of their minds, it breaks them right down and melts them at the feet of Christ. 2. Before the gospel can take general effect, we must have a class of extempore preachers for the following reasons. 1. No set of men can stand the labor of writing sermons and doing all the preaching which will be requisite. 2. Written preaching is not calculated to produce a requisite effect. Such preaching does not present truth in the right shape. 3. It is impossible for a man who writes his sermons to arrange his matter, and turn and choose his thoughts, so as to produce the same effect as when he addresses the people directly, and makes them feel what he means them. Writing sermons had its origin in times of political difficulty. The practice was unknown in the apostles' days. No doubt written sermons have done a great deal of good, but they can never give to the gospel its great power. Perhaps many ministers have been so long trained in the use of notes that they had better not throw them away. Perhaps they would make bad work without them. The difficulty would not be for the want of mind, but from wrong training. The bad habit is begun with the schoolboy, who is called to speak his piece. Instead of being set to express his own thoughts and feelings in his own language, and with his own natural manner, such as nature herself prompts, he is made to commit another person's writing to memory, and then mouths it off in a stiff and formal way. And so when he goes to college and to the seminary, instead of being trained to extempore speaking, he is set to writing his piece and commit it to memory. I would pursue the opposite course from the beginning. I would give him a subject, and let him first think, and then speak his thoughts. Perhaps he will make mistakes. Very well, that is to be expected in a beginner, but he will learn. Suppose he is not eloquent at first. Very well, he can improve, and he is in the very way to improve. This kind of training alone will ever raise up a class of ministers who can convert the world. But it is objected to extemporaneous preaching that if ministers do not write, they will not think. This objection will have weight with those men whose habit has always been to write down their thoughts. But to a man of a different habit, it will have no weight at all. Writing is not thinking. And if I should judge from many of the written sermons I have heard preached, the makers of them had been doing anything rather than thinking. The mechanical labor of writing is really a hindrance to close and rapid thought. It is true that some extempore preachers have not been men of thought, and so it is true that many men who write sermons are not men of thought. A man whose habits have always been such that he has thought only when he has put his mind on the end of his pen will, of course, if he lays aside his pen, at first find it difficult to think. And if he attempts to preach without writing, will, until his habits are thoroughly changed, find it difficult to throw into his sermons the same amount of thought as if he conformed to his old habits of writing. But it should be remembered that this is only on account of his having been trained to write and having always habituated himself to it. It is the training and habit that renders it so difficult for him to think without writing. Will anybody pretend to say that lawyers are not men of thought? That their arguments before a court and jury are not profound and well digested? And yet everyone knows that they do not write their speeches. It should be understood, too, that in college they have the same training with ministers, and have the same disadvantage of having been trained to write their thoughts. And it is only after they enter upon their profession that they change their habit. Were they educated, as they should be, to extempore habits in the schools, they would be vastly more eloquent and powerful in argument than they are. I have heard much of this objection to extempore preaching ever since I entered the ministry. It was often said to me then, in answer to my views of extempore preaching, that ministers who preached extemporaneously would not instruct the churches, that there would be a great deal of sameness in their preaching, and they would soon become insipid and repetitious for want of thought. But every year's experience has ripened the conviction on my mind that the reverse of this objection is true. The man who writes least may, if he pleases, think most, and will say what he does think in a manner that will be better understood than if it were written, and that just in the proportion that he lays aside the labor of writing, his body will be left free to exercise, and his mind to vigorous and consecutive thought. The great reason why it is supposed that extempore preaching more frequently repeat the same thoughts in their preaching is because what they say is, in a general way, more perfectly remembered by the congregation than if it had been read. I have often known preachers who could repeat their written sermons once in a few months without its being recognized by the congregation. But the manner in which the extempore sermons are generally delivered is so much more impressive that the thoughts cannot in general be soon repeated without being remembered. We shall never have a set of men in our halls of legislation, in our courts of justice, and in our pulpits that are powerful and overwhelming speakers and can carry the world before them till our system of education teaches them to think closely, rapidly, consecutively, until all their habits of speaking in the schools are extemporaneous. The very style of communicating thought, in what is commonly called a good style of writing, is not calculated to leave a deep impression on the mind, or to communicate thought in a clear and impressive manner. It is not laconic, direct, pertinent. It is not the language of nature. It is impossible that gestures should be suited to the common style of writing. And consequently, when they attempt to gesture in reading an essay or delivering a written sermon, their gestures are burlesque upon all public speaking. In delivering a sermon in this essay style of writing, it is impossible that nearly all the fire of meaning and power of gesture and looks and attitude and emphasis should not be lost. We can never have the full meaning of the gospel till we throw away our notes. Commentary note here. I'm learning this as I go. Honestly, I was thinking of writing sermons and preaching them in public because John Wesley wrote sermons, Jonathan Edwards wrote sermons, George Whitefield wrote sermons, even Charles Finney wrote lots of sermons. So right now as I'm reading this, I'm kind of like at a loss for words as to understand, well, why did these men write these sermons? You know, I know that George Whitefield preached randomly without notes in public. So I'm thinking, okay, the reason they wrote these sermons wasn't really to preach them so much in public as it was to just gather their thoughts. Although he does make reference to a one-man reading a sermon and people getting convicted. So it sounds like to me that the use of writing sermons is more like for a meditative and contemplative exercise in your house. And then after you've gathered your thoughts and they're in your heart and they're in your mind, then you go out to the college campus and you just speak your mind. And if somebody makes an objection, you can fire right back, rather than having to be rigid and use a note. So it's about being fresh with your thoughts, and then as you feel that freshness, go out and speak your mind. That's the art he's trying to get forward. Three, a minister's course of study and training for his work should be exclusively theological. I mean, just as I say, I am not now going to discuss the question whether all education ought not to be theological, but I say education for the ministry should be exclusively so. But you will ask, should not a minister understand science? I would answer yes, the more the better. I would that ministers might understand all science, but it should all be in connection with theology. Studying science is studying the works of God, and studying theology is studying God. Let a scholar be asked, for instance, this question: is there a God? To answer it, Let him ransack the universe. Let him go out into every department of science to find the proofs of design, and in this way to learn the existence of God. Let him next inquire how many gods there are, and let him again ransack creation to see whether there is such a unity of design as evinces that there is one God. In like manner, let him inquire concerning the attributes of God and his character. He will learn science here, but will learn it as a part of theology. Let him search every field of knowledge to bring forward his proofs. What was the design of this plan? What was the end of that arrangement? See whether everything you find in the universe is not calculated to produce happiness unless perverted. Would the student's heart get hard and cold in study, as cold and hard as the college walls, if science was pursued in this way? Every lesson brings him right up before God, and it is in fact communion with God, and warms his heart, and makes him more pious, more solemn, more holy. The very distinction between classical and theological study is a curse to the church, and a curse to the world. The student spends 4 years in college at classical studies, and no God in them, and then 3 years in the seminary at theological studies, and what then, poor young man? Set him to work, and you will find that he is not educated for the ministry at all. The church groans under his preaching, because he does not preach with unction, nor with power. He has been spoiled in training. 4. We learn what is revival preaching. All ministers should be revival ministers, and all preaching should be revival preaching. That is, it should be calculated to promote holiness. People say, it is very well to have some men in the church who are revival preachers, and who can go about and promote revivals. But then you must have others to indoctrinate the church. Strange. Do they not know that a revival indoctrinates the church faster than anything else? And a minister will never produce a revival if he does not indoctrinate his hearers. The preaching I have described is full of doctrine, but it is doctrine to be practiced, and that is revival preaching. 5. There are 2 objections sometimes brought against the kind of preaching which I have recommended. 1. That it is letting down the dignity of the pulpit to preach in this colloquial, lawyer-like style. They are shocked at it, but it is only on account of its novelty, and not for any impropriety there is in the thing itself. I heard a remark made by a leading layman in the center of this state in regard to the preaching of a certain minister. He said it was the first preaching he ever heard, and that he understood, and the first minister he ever heard that spoke as if he believed his own doctrine or meant what he said. And when he first heard him preach as if he was saying something that he meant, he thought he was crazy. But eventually, he was made to see that it was all true, and he submitted to the truth as the power of God for the salvation of his soul. What is the dignity of the pulpit? To see a minister go into the pulpit to sustain its dignity, alas, alas! During my foreign tour, I heard an English missionary preach exactly in that way. I believe he was a good man, and out of the pulpit he would talk like a man that meant what he said, but no sooner was he in the pulpit than he appeared like a perfect automaton, swelling, mouthing, and singing, enough to put all the people to sleep. And the difficulty seemed to be that he wanted to maintain the dignity of the pulpit. 2. It is objected that this preaching is theatrical. The Bishop of London once asked Garrick, the celebrated play actor, why it was that actors, representing a mere fiction, should move an assembly even to tears, while ministers, in representing the most solemn realities, could scarcely obtain a hearing. The philosophical Garrick well replied, it It is because we represent fiction as reality, and you represent reality as a fiction. This is telling the whole story. Now, what is the design of the actor in the theatrical representation? It is so to throw himself into the spirit and meaning of the writer as to adopt his sentiments, make them feel his own, feel them, embody them, throw them out upon the audience as living reality. And now, what is the objection to all this in preaching? The actor suits the action to the word and the word to the action. His looks, his hands, his attitudes, and everything are designed to express the full meaning of the writer. Now, this should be the aim of the preacher, and if by theatrical be meant the strongest possible representation of the sentiments expressed, then the more theatrical a sermon is, the better. And if ministers are too stiff and the people too fastidious to learn even from an actor or from the stage the best method of swaying mind, of enforcing sentiment, and diffusing the warmth of burning thought over a congregation, then they must go on with their prosing and reading in sanctimonious starch. But let them remember that while they are thus turning away and decrying the art of the actor and attempting to support the dignity of the pulpit, the theaters can be thronged every night. The common sense people will be entertained with the manner of speaking, and sinners will go down to hell. 6. A congregation may learn how to choose a minister. When a vacant church are looking out for a minister, there are two leading points on which they commonly fix their attention. 1. That he should be popular. And 2. That he should be learned. That is very well, but this point should be first in their inquiries. Is he wise to win souls? No matter how eloquent a minister is, or how learned, no matter how pleasing and popular in his manners, if it is a matter of fact that sinners are not converted under his preaching, it shows that he has not this wisdom, and your children and neighbors will go down to hell under his preaching. I am happy to know that many churches will ask this question about ministers. And if they find that a minister is destitute of this vital quality, they will not have him. And if ministers can be found who are wise to win souls, the churches will have such ministers. It is in vain to contend against it, it is in vain to contend against it, or to pretend that they are not well educated, or not learned, or the like. It is in vain for the schools to try to force down the throats of the churches a race of ministers who are learned in everything but what they most need to know. The churches have pronounced them not made right, and they will not sustain that which is notoriously so inadequate as the present system of theological education. It is very difficult to say what needs to be said on this subject without being in danger of begetting a wrong spirit in the church toward ministers. Many professors of religion are ready to find fault with ministers when they have no reason, insomuch that it becomes very difficult to say of ministers what is true and what needs to be said, without its being perverted and abused by this class of professors. I would not for the world say anything to injure the influence of a minister of Christ who is really endeavoring to do good. I would that they deserved 100 times more influence than they now deserve or have. But to tell the truth will not injure the influence of those ministers, who by their lives and preaching give evidence to the church that their object is to do good and win souls to Christ. This class of ministers will recognize the truth of all that I have said or wish to say. They see it all and deplore it. And if there be ministers who are doing no good, who are feeding themselves and not the flock, such ministers deserve no influence. If they are doing no good, it is time for them to betake themselves to some other profession. But they are but leeches on the very vitals of the church, sucking out its heart's blood. They are useless, and worse than useless, and the sooner they are laid aside, and their places filled with those who will exert themselves for Christ, the better. Finally, it is the duty of the church to pray for us ministers. Not one of us is such as we ought to be. Like Paul, we can say, "Who is sufficient for these things?" But who of us is like Paul? Where will you find such a minister as Paul? They are not here. We have been wrongly educated, all of us. Pray for the schools and colleges and seminaries, and pray for young men who are preparing for the ministry. Pray for ministers that God would give them this wisdom to win souls. And pray that God would bestow upon the church the wisdom and the means to educate a generation of ministers who will go forward and convert the world. The church must travail in prayer and groan and agonize for this. This is now the pearl of price to the church, to have a supply of the right sort of ministers. The coming of the millennium depends on having a different sort of ministers, who are more thoroughly educated for their work. And this we shall have so sure as the promise of the Lord holds good. Such a ministry as is now in the church will never convert the world. But the world is to be converted, and therefore God intends to have ministers who will do it. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into his harvest.